One night in 1990, a woman named Tina was driving alone when she realized an unknown man was following her. The driver, whom we'll call John, was behind the wheel of a blue car with a license plate 2FAN 321. Terrified, Tina slammed on the gas and rushed to the nearest motel, hoping to find help. Unfortunately, the place was completely deserted. John pulled into the motel as well. He slipped on a pair of gloves and took a hunting knife and a roll of duct tape from his bag. Panicked, Tina ran into the empty field behind the motel, but John kept chasing her. Luckily, she managed to escape after flagging down a passing truck driver and asking for help. Several weeks later, a veteran police officer from Bakersfield, California, named Joe Deacon, better known as Deke, is assigned a simple task by his supervisor. He's sent to Los Angeles to pick up a piece of murder evidence, a pair of blood-stained boots. Years earlier, Deke had spent nearly 15 years working for the Los Angeles Police Department and had built a reputation as one of its most capable detectives. But 5 years ago, he was suddenly transferred to Bakersfield. When Deke arrives in Los Angeles, he learns that the evidence still needs approval from the Homicide Division, led by Captain Ferris. As a result, he's asked to remain in the city until the following day. While waiting, Deke reconnects with several former colleagues, including Detective Jimmy Baxter. Jimmy is currently investigating a serial murder case that's already claimed 4 victims. The killings began 2 months ago, but the murderer remains unidentified. Not long afterward, Jimmy heads out with Detective Sal and another officer to investigate a newly reported homicide at an apartment complex. He invites Deke to come along. The victim is a young woman named Julie Brock. She was found naked, her wrists bound with wire, her head covered with a white plastic bag, and the apartment stained with blood. As the detectives process the scene, Deke examines a room in the building directly across from Julie's apartment. Its window overlooks the crime scene perfectly. The room is empty except for a single chair positioned in front of the window, suggesting someone may have been watching Julie from there. Then Deke quietly studies Julie's body from a distance. Something about the scene feels disturbingly familiar. The condition of the victim is almost identical to the victims from an old investigation known as the North Case, a brutal murder case Deke worked years ago. In that case, 2 young women were found naked with white plastic bags covering their heads, their bodies positioned against a large boulder. Deke has seen this before, and this is the little things. Elsewhere, a young woman named Rhonda, recognizable by the red hair clip she always wears, is heading home alone after going for a jog with her boyfriend. But on the way back, a brown car begins following her. After that night, Rhonda vanishes without a trace. The next morning, Deke receives word from his supervisor that the blood-stained boots no longer need to be transported back to Bakersfield. Not long after, Jimmy asks Deke to sit in on the interrogation of Stan Peters, a man with a prior record involving sexual offenses. According to local witnesses, Stan had been spotted watching Julie from the building across from her apartment on 2 separate occasions. During questioning, however, Stan firmly denies having anything to do with Julie's murder. Then Deke asks Jimmy to bring up the name Mary Roberts. The moment her name is mentioned, Stan's behavior suddenly changes. He begins acting strangely, almost as if he knows Deke is observing the interrogation from behind the 2-way mirror. The reaction is suspicious enough that Jimmy immediately assigns officers to investigate any possible connection between Stan Peters and Mary Roberts. Meanwhile, Rhonda's parents have officially reported their daughter missing. Although his business in Los Angeles is technically finished, Deke decides not to return to Bakersfield just yet. Instead, he heads to the forensic lab to meet his longtime friend Flo, who is conducting Julie's autopsy. So far, Flo has uncovered several disturbing details. There is a bite mark on Julie's cheek. Traces of mouthwash are still present in her mouth. Based on markings found on her right calf, Flo believes the killer shaved Julie's leg after she was already dead. The examination also reveals that Julie had eaten a large meal shortly before she was murdered. Looking at the overall pattern, Flo believes Julie is likely the 5th victim connected to the Los Angeles serial murders. She also suspects the killer returned to the apartment 2 days after the murder and deliberately repositioned Julie's body so it would be facing the front door. The more they learn, the stranger the case becomes. Because Julie's head was covered with plastic, just like the victims in the old North case, Deke asks Flo to retrieve the files from that investigation. As a longtime friend, Flo agrees to help, but she also makes it clear that if things go wrong, she won't be able to protect him. Later, while they're having lunch, Flo lends Deke the key to Julie's apartment so he can take another look at the crime scene. Back at the apartment building, Deke speaks with the landlady and learns an interesting detail. The refrigerator in Julie's unit had been broken for over a month. The landlady had already arranged for a repair technician from a company called ABC to come fix it. But before the technician ever arrived, Julie was murdered. As Deke continues examining the crime scene, his mind drifts back to the North case, the same investigation he once worked alongside Detective Sal and Captain Ferris. Late that night, Deke checks into a nearby motel. Before going to sleep, he pins up photographs of the three victims from the North case. One of them is Mary Roberts, the same woman whose name he had Jimmy mention during Stan's interrogation. Staring at the photos for hours, Deke becomes increasingly haunted by the past. The memories are so vivid that he almost feels as if the victims themselves are standing in front of him. Meanwhile, back at the station, Captain Ferris warns Jimmy not to get too involved with Deke. He explains that 5 years earlier, Deke pushed himself too far while working a case and ended up destroying his own life in the process. Within just 6 months, Deke went through 3 heart surgeries, lost his marriage, and was eventually suspended from the force. In fact, Jimmy had originally been hired to replace him. At the same time, a troubling development emerges. Stan Peters is found dead the following night. While all this is happening, Deke takes time off and continues investigating Julie's murder on his own. He starts by reviewing repair records from the ABC Appliance Company. When he finds nothing connected to Julie, he moves on to a neighboring repair business called TDA. There, he discovers something much more interesting. A technician had been scheduled to visit Julie's apartment, but for some reason, the appointment was canceled before it ever happened. Elsewhere, the fingerprint recovered from Julie's apartment leads nowhere. The print cannot be identified because the center portion is completely missing. With few solid leads available, Jimmy visits the home of Rhonda, the young woman who disappeared after her evening jog. Her parents tell him that Rhonda always wore a distinctive red hair clip. Not long afterward, a young woman's body is discovered floating in a river. Fortunately, it isn't Rhonda. Deke arrives at the scene and meets up with Jimmy, who wants answers about Mary Roberts. Stan's death after the interrogation has only made Jimmy more suspicious. Deke refuses to explain anything. Instead, he simply hands Jimmy a list of technicians who had worked near Julie's apartment. Jimmy then asks a question that's been bothering him for some time. How did someone with Deke's reputation and accomplishments spend 15 years in Los Angeles without ever receiving a major promotion, only to end up transferred to another city? But once again, Deke avoids giving a straight answer. The more Jimmy learns about him, the more it feels like Deke is hiding something far bigger than anyone realizes. The next morning, one of Jimmy's colleagues uncovers new information about the 3 victims from the Old North case, including Mary Roberts. All 3 women had worked as prostitutes. They were drugged before being stabbed to death, and all of them were murdered in the same location. Later, while Deke and Jimmy sit down for a drink, they discuss the growing Los Angeles murder investigation. At this point, the case has already claimed 6 victims, all killed in remarkably similar ways. Each victim was stabbed, gagged, and had their hands bound. Julie was murdered inside her apartment. 3 of the other victims were killed in North County before their bodies were dumped in Los Angeles. The remaining 2 victims were killed in Los Angeles but later found in North County. That detail suggests something important. If the same person is responsible for all of these murders, then the killer must spend a lot of time on the road. The crime scenes and body dump locations are spread far apart, meaning the suspect likely drives a vehicle with extremely high mileage. But Deke believes the motive goes beyond logistics. In his view, the killer is driven by sexual gratification and some very disturbing fetishes. What makes the case unusual is that none of the victims were sexually assaulted. Jimmy also mentions another strange detail. Investigators found traces of roast beef in one victim's stomach, even though Julie was known to be a vegetarian. The conversation eventually turns back to the North case. Jimmy wants to know why Deke is still obsessed with the deaths of Mary Roberts and the other 2 victims when that investigation was officially closed 5 years ago. Rather than answering directly, Deke takes Jimmy to the original North crime scene. The location sits in a dry riverbed outside Los Angeles. It was there that 2 victims were discovered leaning against a large boulder, facing one another. Both had been stabbed and both had white plastic bags covering their heads. The 3rd victim was found nearby. Back then, Deke had worked the case alongside Sal and Captain Ferris. Despite their efforts, the investigation eventually went cold because no suspect was ever identified. Now Deke believes the old case deserves another look, especially because the Los Angeles murders share one very specific detail. Some of the victims were also found with plastic covering their heads. Not long afterward, Jimmy reports that 2 names from the technician list Deke provided have criminal records. That same night, Deke pays a visit to one of them, a repair technician named Albert Sparma. Almost immediately, something catches Deke's attention. Albert's car has unusually high mileage, exactly the kind of thing investigators have been looking for. When Albert arrives home, Deke begins asking questions about all those miles. He also notices a brochure for a car sale lying on the floor and becomes interested in checking the trunk. Albert claims the brochure belongs to a different vehicle and refuses to let Deke inspect the trunk. With no legal reason to push further, Deke pretends to leave. But the moment Albert throws out his garbage, Deke quietly retrieves the trash bags and takes them back to his motel room for examination. At the same time, he asks Sal to look into Albert's background and find out whether he has recently sold any vehicles. As Deke digs through the trash, one item stands out. It's a leftover pizza crust. He brings it to Flo for analysis, and the results immediately grab his attention. The bite marks on the pizza are remarkably similar in size and shape to the bite mark found on Julie's body. At this point, Deke's suspicions about Albert continue to grow. The fact that a roast beef restaurant is located near the 8AA repair shop only makes him more convinced that Albert could be connected to the murders. Deke spends the entire day following him in a rental car. The surveillance eventually leads him to a nightclub, where he notices Albert handing out food to prostitutes working along the street. But the following afternoon, things take an unexpected turn. While driving along Route 126, Albert realizes he's being followed. Instead of trying to escape, he deliberately takes a little-known turnaround on the highway and heads straight back toward Deke. Then he approaches Deke's vehicle and openly tries to intimidate him, acting as though he has absolutely nothing to fear. Not long afterward, Deke receives a call from Jimmy with an important discovery. The second victim in the Los Angeles murder case had been found near mile marker 467 on Route 126. That information only strengthens Deke's theory. He becomes convinced that Albert is responsible for both the North murders and the Los Angeles killings. The location would have allowed him to travel back and forth between North County and Los Angeles without attracting much attention. As investigators dig deeper, another suspicious detail surfaces. Just a week earlier, a towing company recovered an abandoned vehicle registered to Albert. To Deke, it looks increasingly possible that Albert regularly switches vehicles to avoid detection while committing crimes. Eventually, Albert is arrested at his apartment and brought in for questioning. At the same time, Tina, the woman who was chased at the beginning of the story, arrives at the police station to report the terrifying incident she experienced. As Albert is escorted into the building, Tina briefly sees him. When the interrogation begins, however, Albert seems completely unfazed. In fact, he acts as though he expected the police to come for him sooner or later. Calmly and confidently, Albert explains that he's fascinated by criminal cases and regularly follows local crime reports. He also claims that his previous car was stolen and that he reported it to the police, but never received any updates. When investigators show him photographs of the Los Angeles victims, Albert continues denying any involvement. What frustrates Jimmy and Deke the most is how relaxed he remains throughout the entire interrogation. No matter what evidence is presented, Albert never appears nervous. As his answers become increasingly evasive, Deke's temper begins to boil over. At one point, he's so enraged that he nearly attacks Albert before his fellow officers step in and stop him.
I mean it. Son of a bitch. You dig?
Back off! Why is that? Why is that?
Meanwhile, Tina is asked to review photographs of potential suspects. The moment she sees Albert's picture, she identifies him as the man who chased her that night. Unfortunately, her identification cannot be used as evidence. Because she had already seen Albert in handcuffs at the station, investigators believe that experience may have influenced her judgment and contaminated the witness identification. As the case continues to stall, Captain Ferris delivers more bad news. If no major breakthrough occurs soon, the FBI will take over the investigation in just 2 days. Later that night, Jimmy visits Deke at his motel room. The photographs of the North case victims are still pinned to the wall, a reminder of the obsession that refuses to leave Deke alone. Deke urges Jimmy to let him search Albert's apartment. He's convinced that Albert is connected to both the Los Angeles murders and the Old North case. Jimmy agrees, even though they don't have enough evidence to obtain a legal search warrant. Desperate for answers, the two detectives decide to take a serious risk. Jimmy arranges to meet Albert at a cafe under the pretense of apologizing for the interrogation, giving Deke an opportunity to enter the apartment while Albert is away. As soon as Albert leaves, Deke breaks into the apartment and begins searching for clues. Inside, he finds a film developing room and a police scanner that broadcasts updates whenever officers are pursuing suspects. Then he discovers something even more disturbing. Hidden beneath a section of carpet is a small box filled with personal items, including a woman's wristwatch and numerous newspaper clippings covering different murder cases. Among them are articles about the North murders. Meanwhile, Albert arrives at the cafe and quickly realizes something is wrong. Jimmy's nowhere to be found, and it doesn't take long for Albert to figure out that the entire meeting was a setup. He's convinced that his apartment is being searched without a warrant. Rather than confronting them directly, Albert decides to strike back. He calls the police and files a false report, claiming that a detective has been killed inside his apartment. His goal is simple. If officers catch Deke and Jimmy conducting an illegal search, both of them could face serious consequences. The moment Deke hears over the police scanner that officers are heading toward the apartment, he immediately escapes across the rooftops. Fortunately, he manages to get away before anyone arrives. The following day, Jimmy brings Deke some surprising news. Albert wasn't lying about his stolen vehicle. It turns out he really did report the theft years earlier, but the police department failed to properly record the report. Jimmy also uncovers another interesting detail. About 6 weeks after the North murders occurred 5 years ago, Albert traveled all the way to Detroit. To Deke, that raises even more questions. If Albert really is the killer, a sudden trip that far away could have been an attempt to distance himself from the investigation and avoid police attention. Despite all the uncertainty, Jimmy and Deke agree to continue watching Albert. They spend the day following him through heavy traffic, hoping he eventually makes a mistake. Oddly enough, Albert leaves his perfectly functional car behind and takes a bus to a nightclub instead. The detectives watch him carefully, but nothing unusual happens. Eventually, Albert simply returns home. For a while, it seems like another dead end. Then everything changes. While Deke briefly steps away to a convenience store, a nearby payphone suddenly rings. Moments later, Albert approaches Jimmy. Caught completely off guard, Jimmy immediately pulls his gun and demands answers about Rhonda, the missing woman. He becomes convinced that Albert knows exactly where she is. Under mounting pressure, Albert finally offers to take Jimmy to her location. But there's one condition: Deke cannot come along. Desperate for a breakthrough, Jimmy agrees and gets into Albert's car. Fortunately, just after the vehicle pulls away, Deke spots them leaving and immediately begins following behind. As he drives, memories of the victims flood back into his mind. Every one of them had been a woman. Meanwhile, Albert's behavior grows increasingly suspicious. Eventually, they arrive at a massive empty field far from civilization. Once there, Albert points to a spot in the ground and claims that Rhonda is buried somewhere nearby. Then he tells Jimmy that he'll have to dig for her himself. Jimmy remains cautious, constantly watching Albert in case he suddenly attacks. But Albert seems more interested in playing games. One moment he points to one location, then another, then another. Each time he suggests a different place where Rhonda might supposedly be buried. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Jimmy keeps digging wherever Albert directs him. By this point, Jimmy has already dug 2 large holes, but there's still no sign of Rhonda's body. As the search drags on, Albert suddenly claims that he has never killed anyone in his entire life. Jimmy doesn't respond. Instead, he keeps digging wherever Albert tells him to. But with every empty hole, Jimmy's frustration grows worse. Albert continues pushing his buttons, even bringing up Jimmy's family and suggesting that this nightmare will never end. The longer it goes on, the more Jimmy begins to lose control. Then everything spirals out of control in an instant. Consumed by rage and exhaustion, Jimmy suddenly strikes Albert with the shovel. The blow kills him. Almost immediately, Jimmy realizes what he's done and panics. Not long afterward, Deke arrives and finds Albert lying dead on the ground. Seeing that there's no way to undo what happened, Deke takes charge. He tells Jimmy to keep digging, this time making the hole deep enough to bury Albert's body. Meanwhile, Deke heads back into town to clean up the mess and protect Jimmy from the consequences. As he drives, memories from 5 years earlier come flooding back. Back during the North investigation, Deke had responded to the discovery of 2 murder victims. While searching the area, he heard movement nearby and became convinced that the killer was still at the scene. When he saw someone approaching in the darkness, he opened fire. But the person he shot wasn't the murderer. It was Mary Roberts. She had been a witness and a friend of the 2 victims. The mistake changed Deke's life forever. Captain Ferris, Sal, and Flo helped cover up the shooting. As the forensic examiner, Flo even altered the official report to make it appear that Mary had died from stab wounds inflicted by the killer. From that moment on, Deke's mental state began to unravel. His guilt consumed him. The case remained unsolved, and he was forced to live with the knowledge that he had accidentally killed the one person who might have known the identity of the real murderer. That burden destroyed his health, his career, and his family life. Without wasting any time, Deke goes to Albert's apartment and removes everything that could connect Jimmy to the incident, including the small box hidden beneath the carpet. But when he checks the box, he discovers that all of the items inside have already been discarded by Albert before his death. Ironically, those objects may have been the strongest pieces of evidence linking Albert to both the North case and the Los Angeles murders. Deke then takes another step to erase any trace of what happened. Wearing gloves, he arranges for Albert's car to disappear by giving it away to some local young men, ensuring that any fingerprints connected to the scene will be lost. After loading Albert's belongings into his vehicle, Deke returns to the desert and helps finish covering up the body. Even though he firmly believes Albert was responsible for the murders, he reminds Jimmy of an important fact. Albert was never officially declared a suspect. Because of that, Jimmy should tell Captain Ferris that Albert had no known connection to the case. Deke then encourages Jimmy to take a vacation and put the entire ordeal behind him. He warns him not to let this one mistake consume his life the way the North case consumed his own. Sometimes it's the little things that end up destroying a person. With the Los Angeles investigation ending much like the North case years earlier, Deke finally finds a sense of peace. For the first time in years, he is able to let go of the past. He leaves the North case files behind in his motel room, where they are eventually thrown away by the motel owner. Meanwhile, the Los Angeles murders remain officially unsolved. No suspect is ever charged. The only explanation Deke provides is that Albert Sparma disappeared from his home and cannot be located. Jimmy, however, struggles to move on. The memory of what happened in the desert continues to haunt him, even when he's spending time with his family. Wanting to ease Jimmy's guilt, Deke sends him a package through Sal. Inside is a red hair clip that appears to belong to Rhonda. The implication is clear. Jimmy is meant to believe that Albert really was the killer and that Rhonda was one of his victims. But the truth is much more complicated. Deke simply bought the hair clip from a regular store. In the film's final moments, Deke burns all of the belongings he took from Albert's apartment, destroying the last remaining traces of the man and burying the truth right alongside them. So the moral of the story is sometimes the hardest thing to live with isn't the evil we couldn't stop, but the guilt of one mistake that follows us for the rest of our lives.